Hey guys, John Polemy here, Actionable Intelligence. Today is Saturday, October 12th, and this is the weekly market update. A disclaimer, anything that you hear or see on this podcast or video is not to be taken as investment advice. I'm not a registered financial advisor. I cannot give you individual investment advice. This is for informational and entertainment purposes only. Please do your own due diligence. It's your money. It's your responsibility. Okay, so one of the themes that I've been talking about is the out of control spending, debt accumulation, not only in the United States, but in the entire West, which is leading to, I believe, the destruction ultimately of the West. I don't know exactly how that's going to play out, but I just see a big problem here that continues to get worse. And no one is talking about doing anything about it or is going to do anything about it. And so, we're caught into this debt doom loop, and which I think will ultimately result in being resolved via the printing press, which I've stated. Again, as I've said before, and I want to caveat this doesn't mean you run out next week and think this is actionable. This is likely going to play out over a long period of time. There's a substantial amount of wealth and friction on the way to the ultimate destruction. But the trajectory and the path, I believe at this point, has been unsustainable. And so we're reporting on what the government reported itself this week about fiscal year 2024. So they had the CBO report was reported on Tuesday, shows that the U.S. deficit surged to $1.8 trillion in fiscal year 2024, representing 6.4% of GDP, the most significant shortfall since 2021. That's $139 billion more than the deficit of fiscal year 2023 and nearly $400 billion more than fiscal year 2022. Government spending jumped 10% year over year to reach $6.8 trillion. The biggest expenditures included Social Security, which was $1.5 trillion, interest payments on debt, $950 billion, and Medicare, $869 billion. Federal debt also swelled by $2.2 trillion over the past year, hitting an all-time high of $37.7 trillion this week. The trend underscores the persistent crisis of U.S. deficit spending. So let's unpack a little bit of this. We're talking about the best economy. If you listen to one of the presidential candidates and the current president, that everything's fine, everything's great. Of course, you deficit spent $1.8 trillion, most of it wasted, in my opinion, which is 6.4% of GDP. You're talking about wartime levels of spending. This is not sustainable long-term, folks, because that's just for 1 year. That goes on top of the $35 trillion of debt we've already accumulated, which you have to pay interest on. That's why interest rates are being cut by the Fed. So if the market was able to function and set rates properly, do I think that, and not manipulated by the Federal Reserve and the government and the Treasury, do I think that interest rates would be lower or higher? They would be higher, because market participants would look at it and say, how is the government going to pay this debt back over 10 years on this trajectory? And based on previous reports that the CBO has done and other entities in the federal government, we're going to be at $50 trillion by the end of the decade in debt. The problem is the increases in debt are rising at a level faster than the GDP. And so the ability to service the debt is going to get harder and harder and harder. And so this is the problem that I foresee, and why ultimately you're going to run into a massive amount of money printing. They're not going to they're not going to pay it back. They're not going to let it collapse. So they're going to print money. That's what governments have done throughout history. This is why I think that you've crossed the Rubicon. It doesn't matter who gets elected. It doesn't matter one iota. This is going to continue until it can't continue anymore. And they're going to put Band-Aid on top of Band-Aid on top of Band-Aid. And your standard of living for the average person will go down over time. And again, instead of stop bowing down and hoping that these politicians who are know-nothings, all of them, just about all of them, don't know anything, okay? Thinking they're going to solve your problem. Let's unpack the second blurb here. The biggest expenditures were Social Security, interest payments on the debt, and Medicare. I wrote an article about 5 years ago about how Social Security and Medicare would ultimately destroy the United States of America. You know, we're in that prime baby boom retirement phase now. The baby boom, the most selfish, narcissistic, worthless generation in the history of the United States, who only cares about themselves, you know, they vote. And so this is the spending. 10,000 of them go on Social Security and Medicare every day going forward for years. And this is your highest spending level. This is your highest fixed spending that you have. That represents, you know, 1.5 trillion Social Security and Medicare 869 billion. So I'm not going to argue with people about the merits of Social Security. I've already done that. It's not a pension plan. It's not an annuity. You don't have an account there. It's not a 401k or an IRA. It's not that. It's a welfare program. Okay. It's a transfer payment that has already been decided by the Supreme Court back in the 50s. But people, you know, have this view that it's not that because they didn't prepare, they didn't do anything for their retirement. And so they have to rely on Social Security. And a lot of people do, unfortunately, rely on Social Security. And there's not going to be any reform yet. I mean, I saw ads running down here in Texas against Ted Cruz, accusing him of wanting to raise the Social Security age that you can start taking it. This is all going to happen regardless. Okay, the benefits are going to have to be cut. Retirement ages are going to have to go up. It's just going to get a squeeze because there's not enough money. Okay, it's not enough money, and no one's talking about reforming it. You can't even bring it up, or it's the political third rail. And so these in Medicare, this is just rife with fraud, and this whole medical mafia, which I don't have time to get into. We've talked about it before. I mean, that thing that is just a total ripoff, and you know, seniors rely on that also. The whole health insurance thing, everybody knows this is a giant ripoff and scam and grift, yet no one does anything about it. Well, keep paying till the whole thing collapses, and you're going to have to be a cash payer. You know, I've lived lived in many third world countries where I got good medical care because I paid cash, and it was very cheap and very good, and the people that gave me medical attention were very well educated and studious, and it cost a fraction of what it cost in the United States. You're going to see that again after we get into a cash and carry, and a lot of people are going to suffer, and a lot of people are going to die because they're not going to get appropriate medical care because there isn't going to be any money. Now, this isn't going to happen next week. This is going to be over time. This is going to happen. Just as you're seeing it, everybody just has this sense that in the United States, things just aren't right. Yeah, the place is a dump. It's rife with grifting, and people just, like I said, strip mining the country. And it's not going to change. And so you have $35 trillion in debt. We're supposedly in a great economy. We had a deficit that was 6.4% of GDP last year. I don't see either candidate that gets in there is going to cut spending. And I had actually a WAG come on last week's video. I think this was mentioned, and say, you know, I said, if you got rid of this deficit spending, the reason you won't get rid of it and balance the budget is because the economy would collapse. You telling me if you take 6.4% of GDP and just stop spending it next year, that wouldn't affect the economy? It most certainly would. You can't even measure the reverberations. You're seeing an exact experiment of it in Argentina right now. Mr. Milei, the place is so beaten down, people are so fed up after 50 years of nonsense policies. They put a libertarian in there, an anarcho-capitalist, and he has a surplus now. 50% of the population lives in poverty, but hopefully they'll be able to turn it around. We'll see. Do you think that that's politically acceptable here in the United States? Now, things aren't that bad yet, but we're on that trajectory. And so this will continue until it can't continue anymore. And we get the same canards from certain politicians. We're going to tax the rich. You could confiscate all of the wealth of all of the wealthy people in the country, and it wouldn't make a difference. People don't understand how big these numbers are. Okay. And most people don't have the time or inclination. People don't care about this until they care about it. Until we have. So what we're going to end up having is a currency crisis at some point, because I've mentioned this many, many times in the past, and I'll mention it one more time. There has been tremendous sparring between Dr. Ron Paul when he was in Congress and various central bank governors or central bank chairmen. And I remember distinctly the conversation once that Ron Paul had with Chairman Greenspan. Greenspan used to be an advocate for gold. He was a hard money guy. He was an Ayn Rand follower when he was younger. Now he grew out of that, but he knows what money is. But hey, if somebody says you can be the Fed chairman, it's got to take the ticket. Why not? Right? It's going to be somebody else's problem down the line. Again, these things manifest over decades. It takes years for this stuff. And this goes back. This conversation was probably 20 years ago. And Dr. Paul asked about, the math and the growth of Social Security and Medicare and how they would eventually consume the United States government's budget. As you can see, the wave of baby boomers coming. It's a math problem. It's not an opinion. This is math. Some amount of people in a certain demographic cohort that are entitled to these benefits. When they start taking the benefits, what's it going to cost? And that was the question. And how are we going to pay it? And Mr. Greenspan said he had agreed that the math doesn't really make sense. He didn't say it exactly that bluntly, but basically. And he said that the benefits would be paid because the United States has a printing press, and it is the reserve currency, and it can print as many dollars as it wants. However, he had a caveat with that. He could not guarantee the value of those dollars. I mean, that is the most simplest explanation. I saw Representative Massey made another demonstration for the people that aren't very bright. He took one of his colleagues' glass of iced tea that was half full, and he poured water into it, and you saw the tea go from dark to light. And he said, this is what happens when you print money. You dilute the tea, like the water diluted it, you dilute the value of the existing stock of currency. You undermine it, you dilute it. So these are simple principles. People just don't want to face it because people don't want the pain. We have created a society now where, the politicians have told you you can have your cake and eat it too. And so they're a reflection of the people. It's not like pointing the finger at these, but that's easy to do. It's a lot harder to look in the mirror and say, we're the problem. So this will continue until it can't continue anymore. We haven't even had a recession yet. So we're at spending levels of 6.4, deficit spending levels of 6.4% of GDP. And we haven't even had a real recession. In a recession, you have automatic spending stabilizers that go into effect to support the unemployed and people that don't have food and all these programs. And it usually explodes at unemployment benefits, all this stuff. So I guess unless we don't ever have another recession, we should be fine, right? I don't know. Ultimately, we're going to have another recession. The deficit's going to continue to explode. The Fed's going to have to come in and do QE, whether we like it or not. This is the track that they're always going to be on. I mean, they can't, they cut rates and the long bond went up. This is not good. Okay, this is not good for the U.S. So that can't be allowed to continue. Okay, You can't, unless they're just going to lower short-term rates, keep lowering them, and then, roll all the debt into 30 and 60-day T-bills. That's pretty stupid. But, this is what the political class does, right? These minions of the political class that like their perks and power, and, hey, I'll do the best I can and bail out, and it'll be somebody else's problem. That's, I think, a lot of the thinking with these people individually. They get caught up in it, and a lot of people believe their own nonsense. But this is not sustainable. It's not sustainable for you as a person in your household. It's not sustainable for a business. And history has shown it's not sustainable for empires and countries. Ultimately, a day of reckoning comes. And then, when it comes, then it's a big problem. It's not a it's one of these things that's not a problem until it's a problem. And then it's the biggest problem out there. So we'll continue to follow this because it's a major theme here. This is why I think one of the reasons hard assets have been doing better recently, because people understand the money. People can't understand. It's like, why are we cutting rates if the economy is doing so well and the stock market's at record highs? What is that going to? Well, they're cutting rates because they need to finance the debt. The interest I show here is interest payments on debt at 950 billion. They're already over $1 trillion, and they're just going to keep going up unless they get those rates down, because you keep having to roll the existing debt and you keep throwing more debt on the debt pile. And so you get to a point where no matter what you do, you're like the guy that's, buying food with a credit card, or he doesn't even wear the underwear he's wearing. He doesn't own the underwear he's wearing because he's making payments on it, on his credit card. So, yeah, this is not good. And then again, you have, again, like I talked about in recent podcasts and on interviews I've done, you have, people said, what did we miss on this recession call? Well, the fiscal spending that the administration, this government's been doing coming out of the pandemic has skewed, I think, what you would normally see if you raise interest rates 500 basis points in a year. We didn't see the recession because we spent so much money on the fiscal side that it counteracted the effects of raising rates. Now, certain industries did get hit. We're in recession. Manufacturing is in recession and has been in recession. You could make that argument, but manufacturing in the U.S., because it's been hollowed out, is only 12% of the economy. And so, you don't notice it. And so, yeah, this is interesting. So again, this is why I'm an advocate for tangible and hard assets. I don't think you're going to get out of this. I think it's inevitable what's going to happen. My bet is that this government's going to do what other governments have done and debase their currency. And that will work at first a little bit. And then ultimately it ends in a disaster, in a currency crisis, when the currency, because once they started this, you can't stop it. You're not going to stop it. No one's going to stop it. You need a crisis that's so painful that there's no other option, like they had in Argentina. But that took 50 years to get to that point. So if you're a young person, you need to think about that. If you're going to stay here, I recommend people think about leaving the United States. There's other places you can go that have more potential and more opportunity, because there's going to be a lot of chaos here. There's going to be a lot of political and economic and social upheaval, and it's going to be hard to make your way. There'll be pockets of areas. I mean, this is a continent size. It's not going to be like, troops lining up on the battlefield of Vicksburg or Battle of Manassas and shooting at each other. You're just going to have all this chaos, and it's going to be underpinned by all this economic chaos. And so if you don't read this thing exactly right, why not just look at what's the opportunity set in other places that aren't going to be this chaotic? Because you're basically living in an empire that's in decline. So here we go. I mean, this is the U.S. spending and revenue. We don't have a revenue problem. We take in a lot of, like $4.8 trillion a year in revenue. It's a spending problem. And so you have, here's your main expenditures, right? So security, interest, Medicare, and then the Defense Department. This is going to have to be reduced massively, folks, whether you like it or not. We can't spend And that's not going to happen until we have a crisis. It's not going to happen until we have a crisis, because you have a military, industrial, congressional complex that's set up to, this is what I talk about when I say strip mining the U.S. Spent, depending on how you want to look at it, somewhere around 15 to 17 trillion dollars fighting those useless wars over the last 3 decades in the Middle East. And what did you get for it? Nothing. That's where a lot of the money went. Then you ask yourself, why did we do that? Well, that leads down a rabbit hole that I'm not prepared to go down in a YouTube video. Yeah, so here you go. So when you have wars everywhere, then you have a huge Veterans Affairs spending, because you have to take care of all these broken people that you broke. And it just goes on. Your Department of Education, that should just go away, right? Because let the states deal with it. This is just layer, and I have show a chart later on of how that works, what's going on there. It just goes on and on. So, it's just, you look at the main spending, then you look at like other outlays. I mean, all these agencies, I saw Mr. Trump talking about with Mr. Musk that they're going to create this commission and they're going to redo. No, you're not. Again, this all sounds good in sound bites. It's not going to happen. You could do things like, if I became president, the first thing I would do is put a hiring freeze on for the federal government and slowly attrit the federal bureaucracy. You cannot just go in and do layoffs. The laws are set. These public employee unions have calcified and fossilized themselves into these positions, okay? They unionized their workforce. They made political contributions. They created rules in the federal civil service rules. You can't just come in and just lay off everybody. It sounds good in a rah-rah meeting on the campaign trail, but what's realistic? You can't do it. The best thing to do, and people would go nuts if you said this, just send them all home. Pay them and send them all home. Don't even come to work, because all you're doing is causing more mischief in the economy. So I think there's some things you could do over time but the administrative state is calcified. It's the same thing. There's certain things you could do at the margin, but it would take many decades. It took decades to get to this level. You're not just going to unwind it in one administration. And so as soon as this party goes out of power, then the next one comes and rehires everybody. This is how you've had the most growth in employment has been in government jobs. Do we need more government employees? Do we need more, people going out and harassing people in business? Some people would say, yes, we don't have enough regulation. We don't have enough oversight. So cross-border capital, people I like to follow for liquidity. This is the heat map. These are all the countries. You can't see them because it's really small print. But basically what I wanted to show you here is World Central Bank Liquidity Heat Map, end of September 2024. And as you see, liquidity was tight in the large majority. This really visualizes for you. And you see, as we went through, as I talked about in late 2023 in August, about 14 months ago, you started seeing things loosen up. You see more and more central banks cutting rates. You see the central bank liquidity. We're in a upcycle now for central bank liquidity around the world. So this kind of gives you a good visual standout, like right in your face, what's going on. So I just wanted to show you that's nothing new that we haven't already talked about, but I think it was a good visual. So this is an interesting chart. University of Michigan, mean expected change in prices during the next 5 to 10 years. This is a survey, and what we're seeing is an explosion basically upwards in expected change in prices. And this is what happens, I think, sometimes in a environment where inflation doesn't get fully dealt with. People then realize that inflation's now endemic and they expect inflation in the future. And that does affect behaviors. People, seek their own self-interest and look for the best outcome for themselves individually and will react accordingly and make adjustments accordingly. So this is not a positive thing. And you'll see that inflation expectations have been going up basically since the pandemic back here. And so now it's, surging in 2024. Not good. Now, again, as this Craig Shapiro says, this is a survey of a small group of people, but you get the point. And so this is over the last month. This is the effects of money printing. People conflate. They say, well, the price of stuff went up, so inflation's up. Inflation is creation of more currency units. The effect of creating more currency units is rising prices. And this is what you have. These are just, again, the Cantillon effect. If you raise the amount of currency units and liquidity, you don't necessarily know what it's going to go into. It can go into stocks. It can go into gold. It can go into Bitcoin. It can go into sunflower oil or iron ore or sugar or what have you. So this is why it's so insidious and such a terrible thing, because yes, for the 1%, it makes your assets go up, or for us people that have assets, it makes our assets go up in value, but it also has a tendency to flow into areas unanticipated, like things that people need to live, which like commodities, for example. So I wanted to point this out. U.S. bankruptcies hit 512 year to date, the most since 518 seen during the COVID crisis in 2020. And yet the economy, we are told, is doing fine. This is why I think people are so confused. Well, I'm confused because you have all these data sets that are basically, some show that things are fine and some things show that we're not fine, and it's just about even, right? So you're getting pushed and pulled here about what's really going on with the economy. But again, this is not positive. You can't say the economy is doing well when we have bankruptcy rates on the increase. We shut the economy down, and so we had a tremendous amount of bankruptcies. This is supposed to be, this great economy, according to what we're told by the media and, propaganda and the administration. So this is interesting. The U.S. as a portion of world GDP is decreasing over time for several reasons, mostly because the rest of the world's increasing as a percentage of the total pie. The emerging global South and East, talked about this before. And so the U.S. is declining as a economic contributor to the total pie, or as a percentage of the total pie. I think it's 22% or something like that. And yet the U.S. stock market is 50% of the total world market cap. I don't think that that's sustainable. You have a market that's way overvalued relative to the size of the economy. We've shown that with the Buffett rule, right? Where you look at the stock market capitalization as a percentage of the country's GDP, and it's at levels that in the past were recognized as tops, yet we continue to move higher. Again, as I've said many times over the last couple of years, I know I've said it many times, just because something looks unsustainable or looks toppy or on a historical view in the past has been a top, doesn't mean things can't just get more ridiculous. And now that they've turned the money printer back on, who knows what can happen? I was interviewed this week on an interview, and the interviewer asked me, well, what do I think about the stock market? Can it go higher? Absolutely. You don't know where the liquidity is going to go. When that's the whole basis of Cantillon's effect, right? You don't know where you create the liquidity, but you can't necessarily direct where the liquidity goes. And it has a tendency to go into these financial assets. And this is a perfect example. People will say, this whole period from when Volcker supposedly crushed inflation, we had this disinflationary environment, low inflationary environment. up until the pandemic, there was no inflation. John, what are you talking about? Yes, there was. It was in the stock market. It was in asset prices. It was in the stock market. Because if you look at the S&P, percentage change in the S&P index during that so-called period of low inflation, yes, prices in goods didn't go up, but prices in assets went up tremendously. But if you inflation adjust those same S&P returns, you only had just regular nominal returns for the S&P were 6,540%, but inflation adjusted, they were only 600%. And that's from 1967 to 2024, basically my lifetime. And so you see things pretty much were the same. And then what happened in this era? Isn't this when we kind of went off the gold standard and took the limits off government and its ability to spend and create money? Yeah, it was around this time. It was 1971. And then things just slowly over time. And now look where we're at, So this is starting to look like one of those stock markets and one of those emerging markets like Venezuela, or not even say emerging market, one of those basket case countries like Venezuela or Zimbabwe. But if you inflation adjust it, you're only up 600%. This is why people don't understand the terms nominal returns, real returns, nominal interest rates, real interest rates, nominal GDP, real GDP. You have to take inflation into consideration and how it affects things. And the politicians love this, right? Because these returns that were driven by money printing, they loved the capital gains that came in from it. But your actual inflation adjusted returns for the investor were a lot lower. So there's a lot of people that are incentivized to have inflations. The oligarchy that has all the assets, wealthy people that have assets, the government that needs revenue. But again, who takes it on the shins? Again, going back to this chart or a slide, again, when you have money, you can't actually control exactly where it goes all the time. And so you have this happening. Sunflower oil is a major cooking oil in many places around the world. It's up 30%. So this was a John Quake's tweet that was attached to a Bloomberg article. I don't have access to Bloomberg, so I'm not going to pay them. I'm not going to pay Mike Bloomberg for access to his site. But anyway, basically the gist of it is that CEO of Canada's uranium mining partner, Orano, says they're, quote, in monitoring mode, unquote, for potential acquisitions as, quote, questions over where uranium will come from in the next decade are pulling prices higher, unquote. So we already know that. I think we're already starting to see some mergers and acquisitions, right? We've seen some companies merge. We've seen Paladin take over Fission. And I think we're going to see more consolidation. That is positive. That will be another positive for this uranium bull market as we see consolidation. That will bring more interest into to this market, more money into it. And so I look at this as a positive. So I'm hopeful that we will see a uranium mergers and acquisition wave, because you really do need to consolidate a lot of this into some bigger companies. You can't just have like one company developing this, like, it's not as efficient. You got a company developing like 1 million pound per year ISR when it should just be basically probably taken over and amalgamated into a larger company with more resources. It's just more efficient. So I suggest we'll probably see that at some point. Hopefully we'll see that, and that should lead to even more upward movement in uranium stock prices. So I'm still bullish on Brazil. Here's a chart by Tavi Costa. Basically, this is the Brazilian stock index total market capitalization as divided by Brazilian M2 money supply. We're at a historical undervaluation as the Brazilian market, as it is compared to the money supply in Brazil. I'm I'm still bullish on Brazil. It hasn't performed as I had hoped, as well as I had hoped. But again, the central bank actually raised rates, I believe, last month. So we'll see what happens. I'm not like all in on Brazil, but I do like the country. I do like certain situations there. So we'll see what happens. Again, liquidity drive markets. So if liquidity is increasing, it's not a one-on-one linear relationship, but if you are increasing the amount of liquidity overall, it has a tendency to flow into these asset markets. So I just put this here. I couldn't put the whole story. This is story which I'll put a link to in the show notes because I find it fascinating. There was a guy evidently that took an $88,000 portfolio, and by the use of Tesla options, he ran his account up to $415 million during one of the periods when Tesla had this big run. So he was able to turn $88,000 into $415 million. Then he turned around and lost it all. And what's interesting is he's now suing, I guess as he got super big, the fiduciaries, wherever he was trading, I don't even know, maybe it was TD or I don't, you have to read the article. But basically, the firm was like, hey, this guy's a whale. Here's some tax planning people you should talk to. Here's some other fiduciaries you should talk to because you're a big deal now. And I guess from what I understand, he didn't necessarily take their advice on some things, and he ended up round tripping his account. I don't know how you do that. He did it, but I think there's a lesson here. It's entertaining. I think it's interesting. It's fascinating. First of all, that the guy was able to do it. So again, you can get lucky by being all in on something and really pushing your bets. It can happen. You can go on a run. This guy did. I mean, I would love to interview this guy and talk to this guy or this person. This would be great to hear this guy's story, his view on things, how he did this, and what the emotions were and his thought process. It would just be tremendous. It would be tremendous. Somebody will probably make a movie out of it after this whole thing resolves. But anyways, he's suing his fiduciaries because, what were they supposed to do? Run over to his house and tackle him and make him do, responsible things? I don't know. I don't know the whole story, but I just find the whole thing fascinating. I guess the lesson I would take about it is don't be this guy. You're going to see these kind of stories where somebody does stuff like this. Your chances of doing it are not slim. More than likely, if you try to do something like this, you'll blow up. And then the other lesson to take out of this, I think, is that when's enough? I mean, when he made 20, 50, 100, 200, 300, 400 million is enough to say, you know what, I'm done, put it all in T-bills. Let me go meet with these wealth managers and let's get this thing set up such that I minimize my taxes and I'm going to go do something else. But evidently, I talked about this when I was interviewed this week, and the interviewer, we kind of talked about this and was like, it's the gambling mindset, right? The gambler gambles until he loses it all. Even if he goes on a run, typical gambler doesn't walk away from the table. The dopamine hits, the psychology, you just keep gambling. That's why, you see it's fun. It's interesting, like in the movie Casino, when the Japanese guy comes in, this tycoon, and he's playing Baccarat, and he hits the casino for several $1,000,000, their goal is to keep him playing because in the end, he'll give it all back. And you remember the scene where they put him on the guy who's cashed out. He's ready to go. He even took, the soaps out of the hotel room and got on the casino's jet. They pretended the jet broke down. He came back to the casino and he said that he wasn't going to play. And of course, he began playing and he gave it all back. So that's the gambler's mentality. And that's what happened here, more than likely. But it would be fascinating to hear the whole story, or just like, dude, what were you thinking when you got to like 400 million? I mean, was this guy like just a regular schlub, or what? Or what got him going on this? Where he's decided, I'm going to go on this run. I'm going to go all in on this. So, and just what precipitated that and what happened. It'd be very interesting. But yeah, this is a lesson of what not to do. So as resource prices go back up, we are going to see more resource nationalism because the countries that they need money and they're not patient. And so we saw this in Indonesia, I think in the Philippines also, where they said you couldn't just export raw nickel, you had to refine it in the country. Of course, this requires billions of dollars of investment, and mining companies don't want to do that because then they know they can be expropriated even more. So long story short, what this leads to is less investment and less mineral extraction and higher prices, because people are not going to want to invest necessarily under the terms of these rinky-dink, third world country regimes where, now, okay, you can't like Kenya. Okay, I've been to Kenya. It was all right. It was a nice places I went. But it's a poor country, right? And it's a developing country, and there's a lot of pressure to make things better, a lot of expectations. Not only that, people in power, they're on the grift too. They want to steal. And so, they pass a law that says they're going to restrict raw exports of gold and other minerals. I didn't read the whole article, but I don't know what other minerals that is, but that's what they're, saying they're going to do. So, okay, you have to refine it or whatever, then you have to build additional infrastructure to do that. And then if I, put this hundreds of millions of dollars or $1 billion facility there, then you can tax that, or a subsequent government can tax it. It's just, people don't have a lot of interest in doing that. And what ends up happening is you stall investment. And if this happens in enough places, this can be even more of a tailwind behind these resources that we need. So something to pay attention to as resource prices go higher, you're going to see more and more of this, not less of it. So I want to talk about this. This is hilarious. You always hear about the children, right? The children, we have to spend more money on education. The key is education. We have to spend more money on education, more teachers. Teachers should be paid more, yada, 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 because the children. Okay, I got it. But yet we see test scores going down. We see academic performance going down here in the US. It's falling relative to a lot of other places in the world. And the answer is just throw more money at it. I'm not going to get into that conversation. I'm just going to point this out, that in the end, the administrative state is there to do one thing: protect its turf and grow its turf. That's it. And so what do you see here? You see, let's go through this. So from 2000 to 2021 or whenever this 22, whenever this was time frame, you've had a 5% growth in students. You've had 5% more students. Yet we've seen 10% more teachers hired. Okay, we got to throw more teachers at it. Get the class sizes down. Okay, you can make that argument. But we've also seen a 39% increase in principals and assistant principals. Okay, why? What do these people do all day except for meddle and, get in the way? And, when I was in school, they had a few people in the office. I never really had any interaction with them. I don't know what they did. Then you look at administrative staff is up 95%. So this is just a sop to more people make work, create empires, that kind of stuff. Okay. Most of the schooling can be done. Do you really need teachers? You should have a few teachers in there. Everything can be done with AI now, computers and iPads, a lot of this stuff. Okay. Let's be honest now. Okay. We got to have all these teachers, on a chalkboard, come up here and do this algebra problem. I mean, really? And so then we have all of these administrative staff. It's just, this is a perfect example of the administrative state and these mandarins. That's what they're there to do: get power, get their salaries up, increase their fiefdom, and always, and every time they don't perform, they're not fired. They just go and ask for more money. And of course, especially at the lower levels in the school boards, you have these busybody people that are normally on there that think they know what they're doing. Most of them are morons. And, there's some good people that serve, I guess, but a lot of people are just there because they're busybodies. And, if Dr. So-and-so with an education degree from, Appalachia State says that we need more money and more funding, then because he has a PhD and it's credentialism, right? Well, I don't know anything. I'm a housewife that ran, that ran because I have kids in school and I think I know what's good for everybody. Okay. And so if this credentialed person says that, who am I to criticize? Give them more money. I mean, this is the problem, right? So there you go. This is not just in schools, it's in a lot of facets of government. And this is why you're never going to solve the problem until you have a complete collapse. And then you're just going to rinse and repeat, because human nature doesn't change. There's a certain amount of sociopaths and busybodies and little administrative state bed bugs that are always going to come out of the woodwork. I mean, this is why you have to be like this Javier Milei with a chainsaw and call them out for what they are. Okay, I'm not going to repeat some of the things that he says, but you can watch his videos. He's very, very blunt and graphic about these people. And, again, I've said this before, a lot of our problems go back to the fact that people don't understand human nature. They don't understand the spirituality we're in, the spiritual warfare we're in. They just look at everything as a material thing that can be solved. If we turn the knobs and pull the levers in the right sequence, everything will be fine. The kind of people that are attracted to government or attracted to the administrative state are not necessarily the best of people. Okay? Why aren't these people working a real job? Why do they want to control and order around other people? That's what a lot of this is. What kind of person is that? There's two types of people in the world. I've said before, people that want to control their environment, builders, creators, people that want to make things better materially, make things better, manipulate their environment. Then there's people that want to control other people, which is a very small portion of the population, but they're very destructive. But until you recognize that and understand that, and people say, I see this all the time. Congress will consistently poll in the single digits of favorability. Yet you ask the average person, they'll say, well, yeah, I hate Congress, but my congressman is okay. Or you'll go say, the state of education in the United States is horrible, the average person might say, but my kid's teacher is awesome. So they're all awesome, but yet, really? So this is what you get. So anyway, it's not something that's going to be solved. It's something to understand. This is my view of reality of how these things work, because it's going to influence how you look at things holistically and how you create a framework for how things are, not the way you want them to be, and why we're going to always end up in the same place. If you read history, there's nothing unique to the United States. It's filled with flawed human beings. We're all flawed to a certain extent. And, the same decisions, dumb decisions are made over and over and over, because people, you have to understand something. Everybody is pursuing their own self-interest. And if you have a skewed view of things, if you're a sociopath or a psychopath or a narcissist, that's a little bit different than the average person, your neighbor out there watering his lawn that you wave to. Those are different kinds of people. And they can be very destructive if they're allowed to run wild. So Massachusetts evidently has a problem with EBT cards. This was funny. This is from the Boston Herald. A staggering 672,483 new EBT cards have been added to the welfare rolls in a little over a year. A tally that's intensifying calls for an audit of the welfare agency. So basically, in this economy that's doing swell, that's everybody's excited about, and we want to, continue, the amount of EBT cards being used in the state of Massachusetts is up 34% in a year. So either there's a lot of fraud going on, or things aren't as good as everybody thinks. And these things, all these programs are fraud. I can tell you, look, I've been all through society, down to the ghettos, to the poorest people, to the wealthiest people, to boardrooms. You're down here in the valley, it's so corrupt. You can pay people cash, get their EBT card. Nobody checks the name. I guess you're just like a driver's license at the grocery store. If you have an EBT card, it can have some female's name on it. You can run it. They're not going to say anything at HEB. This is not how it is. Or you can pay somebody, cash and buy, give them $50 and they'll let you buy $100 worth of groceries. I mean, I don't do that, but people do that all over here. There's all kinds of Medicare fraud down here. It's if you want to know where fraud capital is, Rio Grande Valley. There's a lot of people. That doesn't mean everybody, but there's a lot of fraud down here. Credit card fraud, all kinds of fraud. And, this is everywhere in the United States now. And nobody's going to do anything about it. So, again, it's not a positive trend. And if you import all these people into the country, they can't really contribute to the society, because how does somebody from a peasant class in a third world country come here and compete in a society where we have a permanent underclass that can't compete? And so you can't let them die. And so you start, they have to be supported by somebody. And so you have to ask yourself, why are we doing this? We have a permanent underclass here that we haven't solved their problems yet. We're going to bring the entire world in. And so, again, this will all continue until it can't continue any longer. And again, it's not a single thing that I point out here. People get caught up in this. Well, you don't really understand this issue. This particular issue isn't what you're saying. I'm showing you vignettes and examples. If I wanted to, I could sit here and make it a full-time job and show even more and more. It's out there. And those are the kind of people that aren't going to make it, because they will not acknowledge reality for what's happening. You are in a declining empire that's going to spin apart, and it's going to be very chaotic socially, economically, politically. Okay, rig for heavy weather or don't. That's it for this week, guys. Again, appreciate the support. The channel continues to grow. We're getting more and more recognition. It's all because of you. Appreciate the support. Again, I don't expect everybody to agree with what I'm saying. I don't agree with everybody else says, but we try to put the information out, and we try to set ourselves up for success, and trying to live in a reality-based system instead of how we want things to be. So that's it for this week. We'll talk to you next week. Thank you very much.